Okay, so let's talk a little bit further about these graphs and the domain restrictions, right? So we have the graphs of y equals sine of x and cosine of x and their inverses, right? So I'm going to put in red, right, that sine with its restriction. I'm going to put in red the cosine with its restriction. Notice that we have, right, the line y equals x here, and notice we have that symmetry in the line y equals x for the inverse. Okay? Remember, regarding the domain and range, that the cosine function is bounded between negative 1 and 1. The sine function is bounded between negative 1 and 1. Right? The arc cosine is bounded between 0 and pi. The arc sine is bounded between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2, where the arc cosine is the inverse of the cosine, and the arc sine is the inverse of the sine. Okay? So, explain why each of the following cannot be evaluated. Right? Well, let's think about this. This is saying what angle has a cosine ratio of 2, while this is saying what angle has a sine ratio of negative 1/2. Well, hopefully the answer should be coming to you about why we can't evaluate these. For this first case, no angle has a cosine ratio of 2, right? We can think of this as what angle has a cosine ratio of 2? The answer to that is none. There is no angle with a cosine ratio of 2. I cannot evaluate this. We would say that this is a, let me use a different color pen, that this is a domain error, right? What does that look like on your calculator, right? You'd have these on your calculator, right? Let's clear out these pieces from our calculator, okay? And we say, hey, what is the inverse cosine of 2? Error domain, because no angle has a cosine ratio of 2. And for the other, we have that no angle has a sine ratio of negative 1.5, right? What angle has a sine ratio of negative 1.5? None of them do. Why? Because the sine is restricted in its output, right? It is bounded. And thus, in this case, we have the same issue, which is that we have a domain error, right? That if I were to come over here, right, and say, what is the inverse sine of negative 1.5, I'm going to get that error in my domain. Right, and I can go to that error, and I'll say, hey, here's where your error is, and that is because negative 1.5, right? That those inputs have to be between negative 1 and 1, right? And we say, oh, hey, what is that value right there? Well, is it pi over 2? Nope. It happens to be negative pi over 2. All right? So, using those ideas, explain why each of the following can be evaluated, and then find their value using a calculator. Okay? Well, why can each of these be evaluated? All right? Well, let's look at this first one. All right? Well, what do I know? I know that the cosine of 300 exists, right? I know that this would be like saying, what is the arc cosine of the cosine of 300? What's the cosine of 300? 1/2. Right? So what is the arc cosine of 1/2? The arc cosine of 1/2 is 60 degrees. Notice that I am in my degree mode. Right? How would that look like on my calculator? I would want to make sure I go to degree mode, right? And then I can say that I have the inverse cosine of the cosine of 300, and that output is 60, right? Why is the output 60? Because recall that the inverse cosine has outputs between 0 and pi, right? Inputs between negative 1 and 1 for the inverse cosine, outputs between 0 and pi. 1/2 satisfies that. Okay? If we looked at the one just below it, Okay, arc sine of the cosine of 3 pi over 2. Well, this would be like saying the arc sine of, well, what's the cosine of 3 pi over 2? The cosine of 3 pi over 2 is 0. So we're saying, hey, what angle has a sine ratio of 0? And the answer to that is 0, right? Notice that here we're working in radians, while here we're working in degrees. We've got to be careful about what mode we're working in, okay? And this is clearly talking about angles for this situation, okay? If you wanted to do it on a calculator, here we have it. We could say the inverse sine of the cosine, and here's where I want to make sure that you are checking your setup. What's your mode? Oh, I need to be in radians. Change that mode. And so now I have, right, that I can input this information, right, and there I see my 0, right. The cosine of 3 pi over 2 is 0, and there's where I get to my answer, right. What about over here? The arc sine and the arc cosine. Well, I can evaluate these using my GDC, right? You're going to go ahead and do that on your own, but why am I able to evaluate each of these? Well, simply because my input to my inverse sine is between -1 and 1. Great. And my input to my inverse cosine is between -1 and 1, right? That root 5 over 5 is a number that is between -1 and 1, right? Let's check that out. Alpha y equals second square root of 5 over 5. That is a number that is between -1 and 1, so it's good to be the input here. And whatever this output is going to be fine for the sine, because the sine's domain is all real numbers. Okay, so use your calculator. You can evaluate these. Be careful about what mode you're in, and work through that. If you have questions, remember, ask questions for clarification.